In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Kung Fu Katarist build, which is an all-game build that uses the Katar weapon, which you can get fairly early on in the game, as well as some incantations to seriously boost its damage. So first up, let's take a look at the Katar itself. This is the fist weapon that I chose for this build. You can use other fist weapons. It doesn't have to be this one for this build. But there are a couple reasons I picked it. First, it's not too far into the game. You can get it fairly early on. But secondly, I like the moveset of it. And third, it does pierce damage. So what this allows you to do is get counter damage when you're trading with bosses, which happens quite regularly. And it allows you to use the Spear Talisman as well when you're doing these trades, further increasing the amount of counter damage that you deal. Another really interesting thing about this weapon as well is it has the Impaling Thrust Ash of War on it because it is kind of a piercing weapon. And I showcased this Ash of War during the Spears video if you saw that. It's a very, very strong Ash of War, has very good stance damage, allowing you to break the stance of enemies regularly and then get in a lot of attacks while they're kind of laying there. But what's kind of unique about this is this weapon skill is not applicable to fists, generally. Like, you cannot go and find the Impaling Thrust Ash of War and put it on the Katar, nor any other fist weapon. So if you want a fist weapon with Impaling Thrust, you have to use the Katar, and you have to use the standard scaling of this weapon, or you won't be able to use Impaling Thrust. Another really great thing about Impaling Thrust, too, is that there are a lot of situations in this game where you're locked onto a boss and you're attacking them, and you're still whiffing your attacks because of the reach of the weapon. While Impaling Thrust slides you forward and gives you an opportunity to hit things that are more difficult to hit, and also to deal with shielded enemies. Shield enemies can be problematic for fist weapons because you just sit there and attack into their shield. They block 50 to 60% of your damage, and they usually counterattack you. So it can be kind of difficult, and this is a way around that since you can just attack through their shield, often staggering them, and then you can just finish them off. The Katar also has the highest critical rating of all fists at 110, which allows you to do more critical damage. If you break the stance of something using Impaling Thrust, the follow-up is going to do more damage, which is fantastic as well. Besides this weapon, we also use the Erdtree Seal for casting our incantations, and the reason for that is it's because we had very high faith ratings. You're going to gain the most damage buffs from the damage buffs that we use, Lightning Armament, Bloodflame Blade, etc. So we really want that for this build. However, if you're playing from the beginning of the game, you won't want this because it's not going to perform best at lower levels of faith. The Finger Seal is not a bad option. There are a lot of other seals you can use as you're leveling through the game. I'd recommend just sticking with the Finger Seal because it's easy, and then switching to the Erdtree Seal when you get it. When it comes to your armor, whatever you wear is not super important as long as it's heavy enough to give you decent protection and give you at least 51 poise so you can tank a regular hit. This is important because you want to continue your combos with your fists in order to build up your attack power through things like Millicent's Prosthesis and Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, as well as the Thorny Crack tier that we're using in our Flask of Wondrous Physique. These things will increase your damage the more you strike, so, being able to tank through a hit and trade damage and keep swinging is important. When it comes to talismans, there are three that I really, really like to use, and then there's kind of a flex spot. We have the Spear Talisman. As I mentioned, you do pierce damage with the Katar, so when an enemy is attacking you and they're forward animation, if you hit them, you're going to deal counter damage. This increases that counter damage more, which really ramps up your damage. We have Rotten Wing Sword Insignia because this boosts your attack power by even more than Millicent's Prosthesis, which is important because you don't really need dexterity for this build either. And then we have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which gives us further physical protection because we are trading damage a lot and you don't want to die. Now in the fourth spot, you can use something like Millicent's Prosthesis to give you even more attack power as you attack. It's not a bad choice. You can use something like Shard of Alexander to give you more Impaling Thrust damage. You can use something like Great Jar's Arsenal if you want to have more equip weight and wear heavier armor. Or you could use something like Green Turtle Talisman to get stamina back faster. There are a lot of things you can use here. You can even use the Lightning Scorpion Charm or Fire Scorpion Charm if you're using Bloodflame Blade or if you're using Lightning Armament. Those are not bad options as well. When it comes to spells we use for this build, we have Golden Vow. Obviously, this buffs your attack power and defense. This is also going to boost your spell damage, so if you cast spells that are offensive with this build, which you could because you have tons of faith, then this works really well for you. You also have Lightning Armament, which is kind of the main buff we use on our weapon here. Because of the way we're set up with really no points in strength and dexterity, hardly at all, you're going to get 50% of your damage from the weapon and 50% of your damage from Lightning Armament. So it's about 50-50 between physical and lightning damage. So this is a very, very powerful buff for this build, and you want to make sure it's up all the time or you're going to lose a lot of damage. We also have Bloodflame Blade here. You'll need to put a point or two into Arcane in order to meet the requirement for this, depending on what your Arcane is for your starting class. And this is really to give you a damage type that's not lightning. So if you're fighting a boss that's lightning resistant, then you can buff with fire. It's a good option. It also gives you some bleed buildup and fights where you might trigger a bleed. It's not a lot of bleed buildup, and this weapon doesn't have native bleeding on it. If you're using other fist weapons that had bleeding on them by default, this would be a better fit for it. But it's not really that great with Katar, which is why we lean more to Lightning Armament, but still gives you an option to change depending on boss resistances. We also use Order's Blade here. This buffs you with holy damage on your weapon, so if you need holy damage, there are some bosses that are weak to holy damage. A lot of them are resistant, so you're not going to use this all the time. It only has a 13 intelligence requirement, so it's not hard to meet with this build, but it's good to have in those cases where holy is a good damage type for you. It also buffs your damage versus undead by 100%, so this is a great buff to have if you're fighting undead, and you definitely want to use it in that case. I also have Flame Grant Me Strength here. I hardly ever use this one. I find I use it more when I'm using Blood Flame Blade and this before boss fights. But you can use Flame Grant Me Strength, just before a boss fight or when you get into a boss fight to give you a little bit more damage, but you really don't need it in this build. And lastly, I have Wrath of Gold, which is kind of a nice close range AoE. You can fit other AoEs in here if you don't like this one, but I find that with Katars or fists in general, you don't have a very good AoE, right? Like you don't have like a sweep slash through enemies with like a greatsword or a spear that kind of has a slashing attack, or any weapon that might have some sort of slash that can hit through multiple enemies. You don't really get that with fists. So Wrath of Gold is nice in those scenarios where there's like 3-4 enemies on you and you can just blast them all backward. Works really well, I find. But you can add whatever other spells you want to this build. You have 80 faith, so any sort of incantations that you like you can use, basically, except for ones that have higher arcane or higher intelligence. But everything, other than that is available to you. So if you like to mix in spell casting with this, you absolutely can, although I don't showcase it much in this build, because I was focused more on making Katar's work. So the general strategy with this build is to make sure Lightning Armament is up all the time. You would get 50% of your damage for Lightning Armament, so if you do not have this up, you're going to hit like a wet noodle, so make sure you have Lightning Armament constantly. And you can use Golden Vow, like if you need some extra damage, if you're struggling, and you don't necessarily need it all the time on the landscape, and I don't want to make this into a build where you buff constantly, but Lightning Armament is pretty much non-negotiable. Like, you need to keep this buff up, so make sure that's up. And basically what you want to do is you want to do running attacks into regular enemies and try and kill them in like one, poke, like one basically running attack, and try and wipe them out if you can, and if not, then keep hitting them with R1, staggering them, and just wiping them out. And then when you come to enemies that are more difficult, if you're having trouble like shield enemies, you'll use Impaling Thrust, and you can get a critical attack off that, finish them off. Or maybe you're having difficulty hitting some enemies and, because their body's concave and you're using fists, you can use Impaling Thrust in those scenarios as well. So you're just going to juggle back and forth between, using your fast R1 attacks and using Impaling Thrust. Remember that you can block counter with these weapons too. If you need to block, make sure that you do. It's not something you should be doing often, but you can if you need to. When it comes to stats I have for this build, I have 55 Vigor, 26 Mind, 25 Endurance, 8 Strength, 17 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 82 Faith, and 10 Arcane. So let me run you through some of these stats real quick. Intelligence is not needed for this build. Theoretically, you could make a similar build if you went all Intelligence and used something like Scholar's Armament here. You wouldn't have access to Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength, but you could use Terra Magica to kind of make up for that. So you could make an alternate version of this if you want Intelligence. Otherwise, you do not need Intelligence more than using Order's Blade. So, 13 Intelligence is really all you need. And 10 Arcane is there to meet the requirement for Blood Flame Blade. If you want some other spells that have Arcane requirements, you can add some if you want. Strength and Dexterity really only need to be the minimum requirements for this build, which I believe is like 8 Strength and 10 Dexterity. The class I had started with 12, so I couldn't get lower than 12 Dexterity, and then we had Millicent's Prothesis equipped, so that's 17. But you don't get a lot of damage out of this weapon. You do get more out of Dexterity than Strength on the standard scaling. So Dexterity is definitely better than Strength in terms of, getting damage out of this weapon. But because this weapon just has poor scaling in general, that's kind of why we lean into the Faith route. But if you want to increase the damage of this build moving forward, you're going to continue to increase Dexterity to further boost your melee damage. Vigor's at 55 here. We'll probably take this up to 60 throughout New Game Plus in order to get more health. You trade damage a lot with this build. It's a hyper-aggressive build, so having enough health that you don't have to stop to heal, you can just keep swinging, is really the way you want to go. Mind is at 26. You could probably drop this to 20 if you want. This is kind of an FP hungry build between all the buffs that you have. You don't use them all regularly. Impaling Thrust is pretty cheap. And once you're buffed, you basically just use R1 attacks and maybe an Impaling Thrust here and there. So it's kind of like the buffs eat up a lot of the FP, and you can kind of predict when those are going to be. So you don't necessarily need a lot of Mind, but I wouldn't go too much higher than this, but I definitely wouldn't go too much lower than it either. 25 Endurance is enough to medium roll with this build and give you a little extra room. Ideally, if you were probably min-maxing this build, you would probably have more Endurance, drop Mind a little bit, and you would wear very, very heavy armor to give you even more protection and poise. That would make it easier to attack through hits and trade hits and also not die from hits. But because of the armor that I'm using, it is where it is. So this might fluctuate depending on what armor set you're using. And then lastly, we have 82 Faith here. This is only because I have 80 Faith and then I'm wearing the Haligtree Knight helm, which gives 2 faith. If you don't use this helm, which you don't actually have to use for this build, because 2 faith is not that much, you'll have 80 faith. And in order to get more damage out of your buffs, at some point you'll take faith higher, but it's probably a better use of your points at this point. You're just increasing dexterity to get damage rather than to keep increasing faith. And just a couple of tips before I wrap up this video. I like to use a crack tier that increases the elemental damage of the buff that I'm using for the current fight. So if I'm using a fire on a boss, then I'll use the fire shrouded crack tier. But most of the time this is going to be lightning, so you want the lightning shrouded crack tier most of the time in this build. Or maybe holy if you're going into a fight where holy is good, which is kind of rare, but still happens. So you'll swap that around periodically. And then the other one I like to use is the thorny crack tier, which increases your damage as you attack rapidly. This kind of stacks with Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, etc. So this is really good at boosting your damage as you're sitting there wailing on bosses. When it comes to the Great Rune you want to use for this build, Godric's is not a bad choice here. You need Vigor, Mind, Endurance. You need some Dexterity. You need some Intelligence for the Order's Blade buff. You need Faith, and you need some Arcane in order to use Bloodflame Blade. So this is not a bad one, particularly early on. Radahn's Great Rune is also not bad. Having more health, more FP, and more stamina are all good for this build. You choose your stamina, just spamming attacks. So that's good to have. You do use some FP with this build, so that's nice. And obviously having more health allows you to trade blows and not die. So that wraps up our Kung Fu Katarist build. I hope you guys like this weapon. I am still enjoying making builds for this game. It feels like there are just so many builds you can do. The DLC cannot get here soon enough. We're still going to keep putting out weapon guides. And I thought about also doing some, people were asking for like the shields and the staffs and the sacred seals. Obviously want to do videos on those. We might do a video on armors. We might do some video on talismans and also Ash of Wars, just to kind of mix it up a little bit. I know you guys are looking forward to the weapon videos too, so we'll keep doing those obviously, but I kind of might mix it up with some other videos in the same similar vein, kind of explaining why these are good or bad, but not necessarily with weapons as well. Let me know if that's something you'd like to see, by the way.